having looked at the concept of neglect, having been provided with an overview of some of the research that's taking place in the UK and in the States, we're now going to focus more on Wales. And the next two presentations are about the work that's been commissioned here in Wales on neglect. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce the first of two speakers, Dr. Sally Holland from Cardiff University, who is going to begin by introducing the project and telling you about some of the key findings. And then she will be followed on by Viv from the NSPCC, who is going to elaborate on some of those themes. Okay, to you, Sally.
Okay, so I'm going to tell you about some research we've just done in collaboration with Action for Children and NSPCC, really looking at what's going on in terms of responding to neglect in Wales at the moment. So we've been trying to give a current picture, and then Viv is going to tell you about where we think we should go from here. So this was our research team, but do get in contact if you want more detail about the research. You're very welcome to email me on that email address. Okay, so we were asked by those two charities to look at what was going on with neglect in Wales. So just to do a bit of mapping about what are the kind of procedures, what's going on in the different LSCBs, what tools are being used, and then more, perhaps equally importantly, once we've identified neglect in families, what do we actually do about it? What are our service responses? Okay. And we did that at an all-Wales level, looking at what people were doing in terms of procedures, etc. But then we went into two large LSCBs and talked to people about their experiences. Okay. So that second part, in that second part, we talked to 63 different participants, and you can see the different professions that people came from, all came voluntarily to talk about, in focus groups, about their experiences of responding to child neglect, and it also included some senior Welsh Government officials. Okay, so what did we find out? Well, perhaps slightly to our surprise, we found that nearly all local authorities in Wales used a tool to assess neglect, or they had a tool available. That's obviously quite different from people actually using it in their day-to-day practice. And the graded care profile that's already been mentioned today was by far the most common tool in use. Ruth's already mentioned about the graded care profile and what it does, but just in case anyone was unfamiliar with it, there's an idea of how care is graded across lots of different areas of care, and I'm just going to show you now the areas of care that are assessed. So this is based on Maslow's hierarchy of needs of an individual, including a child, and the graded care profile is looking at those areas and then grading them in this way. We also found there were a load of other tools being used across Wales. Here's a list of some of them. Some of them I know are being used in this area, particularly, of course, Day in the Life tool. And many of you might be familiar with others. So some local authorities had sort of toolkits of with lists of assessment tools that could be used in different circumstances. One of the LSCBs had one to use with adolescents, one to use where parents had learning difficulties, and others to use with children directly. Some just used one tool, like the graded care profile. And only one local authority in Wales, which I won't name, didn't, but it's not represented here, didn't use any tool at all. Okay. So, neglect tools, they sound a bit technical, don't they, and scientific. You kind of imagine you might have to put on a white coat, get your clipboard, and go and sort of observe a family from a distance and give a verdict, a diagnosis. And I think that puts a lot of practitioners off. You think, why would I want to do something like that? I didn't come into social work, health visiting, teaching or whatever to to do that kind of tick boxing. But what we found, and what practitioners told us in their focus groups, and the people who came to focus groups had a lot of experience of using these tools, not all of them, but many of them, told us that they weren't just, obviously, about determining the level of neglect. They did other things too. Particularly, they found they helped relationships with families, and we know how important that is to doing constructive work. They helped relationships with families because they're transparent. You can show somebody what you're doing, and they can see what they're doing, and they can see, and some of them allow for some self-assessment as well. You can demonstrate progress. You can show how somebody might have started when you started the program of work with them, that they were at this level, and then with them you can perhaps assess that hopefully that level has improved a few weeks later. Okay. For some, it was just a real eye-opener for the families, for them to be able to see for themselves just how bad things have got. You know, lots of people can end up with their heads in the sand a bit, perhaps if they're depressed or misusing substances or whatever, and aren't really prepared to acknowledge quite what their children's experiences are. So for some families, that transparency can really help. It doesn't just help relationships with families, according to the people who took part in our focus groups. It helps relationships with other professionals. And of course, we know that that's a really important part of what we're all doing here. What it does is it gives a common language. You can, in some local authorities, and we all know the risks of using jargon, but you can start to say, we think this is a level 4 case or whatever. And where tools were being used across services, people were able to say, look, I've done an initial assessment using this tool and this is what it's come out as. I think we need your service in. Okay. And it helped professionals together to decide whether journey, the distance travelled on the journey of work with a family. And the third important reason that we might use neglect tools is because they help critical and analytical thinking. I think the particular thing about neglect is it can feel quite overwhelming. Families don't tend to just have one problem. They tend to have multiple problems. And it's quite easy to start to feel overwhelmed and not even know where to begin. And we might begin with helping clear up the house, but we know that that's often just a bit of what's wrong going on with the family, and there could be lots of other issues as well. So the tools help us structure what we find out, because if you remember, they make us look at lots of different areas, so we don't get overwhelmed with just looking at the dirty house, which is important, but they help us look at different areas that are also really important to the child's experience. They help us think about what level that's at, and it might be that some areas are being met really well for a child, but some areas not so well. So they help us sort of structure how we think about that. And they seem to help people be confident about taking decisive action, because they've got evidence, and they can that's been very carefully gathered, that they can demonstrate. So it's easier perhaps to go to another agency, or to go to a manager, or to go to court, or go to a child protection conference to explain what you think the strengths and risks are in this family or for this child's life. Of course, we know that they don't do the analysis for us. It's not that you feed in all the information, it comes out with a magic answer, neglect or not neglect. Unfortunately, life isn't as simple as that. And I think you'd all be pretty cynical about using a tool that was as simple as that. But they help us think through and be analytical, but we've still got to do the thinking, of course, for ourselves. And I think, thinking back to Jan's talk, I think both Jan and Ruth talked about how with neglect, we know that the risks are cumulative. It's about being exposed often to neglectful experiences over a period of time. But what tends to trigger action for us as agencies is an incident, isn't it? You know, it's when the child is injured, for example, or left alone somewhere, or found wandering the streets at 2 a.m. And that's quite frustrating for practitioners sometimes. I think I've been saying for 3 years that this child is at risk, and it took this for anyone to take any attention. And I think what these tools can do is that they help us assess and evidence cumulative harm so that we don't have to wait just for the one incident for something to happen. Okay, and I'm just going to show you some quotations from our focus groups just to show you what practitioners actually said about using tools. Oh, it's a bit faint, isn't it? Sorry. Families see that the score has changed. You take the good initial assessment and they score a 7 or 8. And I don't think it really matters which tool you're using for these, and you don't need to worry about what these scores mean. It's a fact that you do this relationship stuff and measure distance. And then you go back and they're down to a 5 or a 4 something, and it's quite tangible for them. So that's about relationships with families. And then this one is about relationships between workers. And this was a worker who wasn't working in children's services. You know, it's good for work, I think they were from housing, it's good for workers, they don't necessarily realise how much knowledge they do hold on that family service. They may not know the child, so this is a service that doesn't work directly with children, but they'll know the family, housing situation, finance, employment issues, and that can all go into it. And again, the majority of parents like it. So we might be worried about sort of imposing something so structured, and might it get in the way in our relationships with families, but the evidence we were getting of people that have actually used these tools is that parents like it, they understand it, they can see where they are and understand what they have to do. And here's one about the day in the life. Somebody's saying that it helps practitioners to understand the lived experiences of children living in the neglectful situation. So that's again helping with our critical and analytical thinking. There were some things that seemed to help us use tools and have protocols for how and when we should respond to neglect, and they were these things: having really strong individuals leading, stable staff groups, which we know can be difficult in some areas, good multi-agency links, and just some things that, you know, might not be so obvious, but they're actually really important, as you will all know from your everyday work. Having an IT system that links, that everything works with, and that perhaps speaks to other agencies. But there were some challenges. It wasn't all roses in these focus groups, and people were talking about uncertainty, including regionalisation. Of course, we didn't just do this research in areas where people had moved forward quite early on regionalisation like you have here. Workload issues, do I have time to do this kind of thing? Limited training budgets. Ruth mentioned about how important it is that people are trained properly in these. You don't just take the pack and go out and see a family. You really need to know what you're doing and practice it as well. Okay. Now, that's the little bit of feedback about tools. I now want to talk to you about responding to neglect. Okay, and we did a literature review at the start of this, and these were some of the things that the research evidence more generally tells us is successful in responding to neglect. And I'm sure that some of this will be quite familiar to you, that we need to have open and trusting relationships with families. We need to understand child development. We need to be proactive in our cases, and we need a strategy right across management. And this isn't just social services, children's services, it's all agencies. Interventions that work best have the capacity to work in the long term with families and can tackle a wide range of problems. As I say, neglect's not a single issue form of maltreatment. We need to be able to work with strengths as well as difficulties, and that's going back to the relationships with families as well. Include fathers as well as mothers. I'm not the first person to have said that today. And improve attachment as well as practical issues. So not just thinking that once the house is clean, that everything's going to be okay. It's not always. Sometimes attachment is at least as important. Okay. So in our focus groups, we had some quite promising discussions about things that are going on at the moment in Wales. There were some clear examples of local confidence in Flying Start services and families' first programmes. I know there are people here from those programmes today, so I hope this is encouraging. And they were people were particularly saying that they were good in terms of preventing the escalation of concerns up to significant harm levels, or as step-down services, so when children come off the register or even stop having child in need status, not having no services in the longer term, which has been a real problem and an issue. And I hope that having this kind of layer of preventative services, targeted preventative services, will stop us feeling that, as perhaps people referring from outside of children's services, that you have to sort of almost prove that this is a child protection, or, you know, the child might end up in care if you don't do something, that we can actually got something we can do at a slightly lower level. So I found that quite encouraging. We spoke to quite a number of head teachers during this research, and we found that they particularly value good relationships with local providers, and sometimes that was in children's services, and sometimes that was in these Flying Start or Families First services. Someone that you could ring and say, I'm worried about this child in my school, and really feel you'd get a sound response. Okay. And there's a quote from a social work manager saying that we're using these services to step down and as a preventative service. But of course there are challenges in, I've got 5 minutes left, thanks Stephen. We've got challenges in how we respond, okay? Services are variable in quality and coverage is patchy. We know that Flying Start is not present universally, for example. In some areas, Families First is very much still bedding in, so people are saying, well, we hope it's going to be good, but we don't know yet. Some people are a bit worried about Families First being quite adult focused. Is it about economic activity of adults, or is it about children? Okay, and in some areas there is skilled and sustained help available through Families First. In some areas they felt not yet anyway. Thinking about chronic neglect, which I think is a real worry for lots of people, there were concerns about planning drift. You know, the cases go on and on and on, and we keep trying little bits of things. We have a scattergun approach. Someone said that everyone has a turn at helping families sometimes, you know, one agency or another. Here's somebody from the health perspective, and they're just talking about this incident issue, you know, a neglect case you've been working with, and suddenly there's a bruise or something, and that changes everything. And that's quite frustrating, I think, when you've been trying to get people to listen for some time. Again, out of our discussions, there were 2 new developments which seem likely to trigger more decisive action. One is just based in Wales, the Integrated Family Support Services. Obviously, that's just where there's substance misuse, at the moment, just where substance misuse is present as well. There was a lot of optimistic talk about those services with most chronic neglect cases. And of course, the public law outline, those of you in children's services will be particularly aware of this, is changing the speed of which we have to make decisions about cases where there might be significant harm, and that might be having an impact on decision-making around chronic neglect. And there were other local structures, and actually I think this is local to at least one of the local authorities in this LSCB. There were some local structures to aid planning, and there was a multi-agency vulnerable children's panel with legal advice where you could discuss a family and see whether you actually need to be taking a legal route or not, and what should be going on next. And that was seen as helpful. Okay, Jan mentioned about adolescent neglect earlier. This is a case of adolescent neglect, not from this area, for adolescents, single mum. Ruth talked earlier about how, in this case, the father had disappeared 5 years ago, about how the absent parent isn't the one we hold responsible for neglect. It was just one of those cases where people had kept trying to help the children coming on and off the register for many years, and then conditions would deteriorate and they'd have new services in or go back on the register again. And it got to the point that things had been seen to deteriorate so badly, and the children's behaviour was causing such concern in the local community, and again talking about triggers, that they actually held a pre-proceedings PLO meeting thinking, should this be going to court, and decided to have one more effort at preventative work with everybody working together, a budget being agreed and everybody agreeing what was going to happen. And for this family, that kind of decisive action with some real resources going in and all the agencies having the same goals at the same time together seems to have made a difference for this family. The mother's undiagnosed learning disabilities were diagnosed by a psychologist, and she began having intensive help from the learning disabilities team, including almost daily home care help. The children's individual needs were noticed and helped, and 2 of them were also helped by learning disability services. Everyone worked alongside the family and got them on board and got them really wanting to do things, and they had a big celebration with the family and all the agencies once some real progress had been made. So a real sense of taking the family with you rather than battling against them. A lot more to the case now, which I don't have time to tell you. It also took a lot of resources, and that family will need ongoing resources, at least till those children leave home, which is a kind of ethical and budgetary issue for us all to think about, isn't it, about how we help families. So just to finish, these are really the this is what worked. I thought I'd done that slide already. This is what I've just been saying. This is what seemed to work with this family. And just to finish, on assessing neglect, identifying neglect, and then what we do in response once we've identified neglect, these were some of the key themes that came across from our research. Multi and interagency working. I know we've been saying this for years, but the fact that we're still saying it suggests that we still need to keep working at it. And some of the ideas, really positive ideas from participants in our groups, were it's really great when people are located in each other's teams, even if it's for a short period, perhaps as a kind of placement, a secondment, having liaison posts between teams, doing lots of, really good information sharing, not just saying we should information share, but actually doing it, and going on joint visits. You can learn an awful lot by two people from two different disciplines going out together, and you'll be giving the same message and discussing with each other what you saw. Relationships with families, absolutely crucial to doing any positive work. People need time to develop those, and we know time can be a really short supply, especially in statutory services. And the participants were keen to point out, and this very much fits with what Jan was saying, ensuring the child's perspective and experience is attended to. And people felt that where cases had gone wrong, it was where people hadn't really noticed really what the child was experiencing. And thirdly, smart planning and decision making based on good analysis and clear objectives. And people in this study felt that tools were helping them do that. Okay, thank you.
Okay, first off, can I just start by thanking you for inviting me to tell you a bit more about the Welsh Neglect Project and about our direction of travel. And I must first compliment you on South East Wales Safeguarding Board for having neglect as a priority, because it's such a huge issue, and also for this exciting and well-organised conference. I think it's really good to be here. In terms of the Welsh Neglect Project, I mean, both NSPCC and Action for Children work in terms of neglect policy and service provision. And after discussions with the Welsh Government, they commissioned us to, sorry, if I turn away, you won't hear me. They commissioned us to deliver the Welsh Neglect Project for 2012-13. I mean, we were actually thrilled that Welsh Government were prepared to work with us. And from NSPCC's experience across the UK, we would say that Wales is further ahead in their thinking about neglect, and also about looking at how neglected children can get the support that they need. The project intent. The project is to research the current evidence base in Wales, existing practice, and to deliver recommendations, resources to improve identification, multi-agency responses, and services to address child neglect across the spectrum of need. The project components for 2012-13, there's an external advisory group to guide the project. We've got new evidence in the form of Cardiff University research that you just heard about from Sally. We've also got we also held in November multi-agency practitioner seminars in North and South Wales, which I'm sure some of you came to. We've got proposals for the next steps, and based on this evidence, we're currently developing a delivery plan for neglect in Wales, and we hope to develop a suite of resources to aid professionals in their work, but this is dependent on sufficient funding as well. As I said, we're currently developing the Welsh Neglect Plan, and we're actually starting to write it. This is our task for the next few weeks. But I just thought I'd share with you some of the emerging recommendations, and also some of the proposed work streams that we're hoping to be taking forward next year. So in terms of the emerging recommendations that will be included in this neglect plan, a key recommendation is to seize the opportunity of the Social Services and Wellbeing Bill, which some of you will have heard and know that was in stage 3 in the National Assembly last night, actually. What we want to do to see that will then lead to a revision of working together, and what we want is that the guidance is revised so it better reflects the new evidence and our new understanding of neglect. In particular, we'd like to revise the definition of neglect, and also what we'd also like in that guidance, because the research and the seminars showed that practitioners really want evidence-based tools and training to help them with their thinking around neglect. We would like the guidance to provide greater direction to about the evidence-based assessment tools to use in Wales. In terms of current preventative services and also the new preventative services that will be developed under the Social Services and Wellbeing Bill, we would like those services to improve the identification and response to neglected children. Nationally, we're very aware since we've had Welsh Government changes, ministerial changes, that children's issues lie in 4 ministerial portfolios. And we think what is going to be crucial is that we have systems in Welsh Government to coordinate that work on tackling child neglect between those ministerial portfolios. Another thing that came out very clearly is that we need better links locally between neglect assessments and the commissioning of services. And there'll be other recommendations in this plan, but as we're writing it, you'll have to wait till the summer when we launch it to see the rest. So, besides... Oops. There we are. So besides developing this Welsh plan with recommendations, we've also narrowed down 4 work streams that we would like to take forward, both NSPCC and Action for Children, in 2013-14. I mean, this is dependent on an extension to our project with the Welsh Government, and we're currently scoping these out, but I just thought it'd be useful to share these with you, share with you our thinking at the moment. One is population needs assessments. I'll go into more details on these in a moment. 2 that work with safeguarding boards, and that's the safeguarding board role in tackling neglect, and safeguarding boards neglect protocols. And then we also want to do some research on best practice in schools. So the first project work stream, the local area population needs assessments. I know that's a long complicated set of words, but this is actually written into the Social Services and Wellbeing Bill, and they're going to be undertaken locally to inform the development of preventive services under this bill. So what we're hoping to do is to do some work to provide support to local areas so that you are able to capture the scale and problem of child neglect in your areas. And then we also want to work with the Welsh Government on the guidance to make sure that the guidance on population needs assessment is informed and captures child neglect effectively. So the second project work stream, I mean, what we're aware from the evidence is that many safeguarding children boards have worked very hard at developing neglect tools, neglect protocols, and providing training to coordinate training to professionals and to coordinate the work between professionals. So we want to build on that. And what we want to do is, one of our work streams is provide support to safeguarding boards in tackling child neglect. So what this proposal is about mapping each safeguarding board's work on neglect, and then provide bespoke support to each safeguarding board to assist them. The third work stream, Cardiff University research found that about half of LSCBs had a neglect protocol in place, and that others plan to develop one. A protocol, of course, provides guidance to practitioners about identifying and responding to neglect and how to work together. So what we are planning to do is to review and evaluate all the current protocols in place, and then perhaps develop, or what we're hoping to is to develop a model protocol and then help disseminate that. And the fourth work stream, we're obviously aware that schools and childcare settings are crucial to providing early support and help to children experiencing neglect and making sure that there are timely and appropriate referrals made to social services. So what we're proposing to do is to do some research on best practice in supporting neglected children in schools and early years settings, and then use those findings to provide guidance to schools and staff in schools and early years settings about best practice and ways to support neglected children.